The diner was packed that afternoon. Forks clinked against ceramic plates. The coffee machine hissed and rattled behind the counter. Somebody laughed too loudly in the back booth. Children chased each other between the tables while their mothers pretended not to notice. It was the kind of ordinary American Tuesday that passes without a single moment worth remembering. The kind of afternoon that dissolves into the week without leaving a mark on anyone who lived through it. And then the door opened. The German shepherd entered first. Massive, white-coated, moving with the particular deliberate calm of an animal that has been trained to walk into difficult rooms and not flinch at anything inside them. He stepped through the door and stopped, amber eyes sweeping the diner in a single slow arc that missed absolutely nothing. Every face, every corner, every exit, every person who had just looked up from their plate to stare at him. And then the man walked in behind him. A metal brace covered his left leg from the knee down. A wooden cane tapped softly against the linoleum with every step. He was not old, mid-40s maybe, with the kind of face that has been through weather that has nothing to do with rain, a face that had seen things and carried them quietly, and was not going to tell you about any of it unless you asked directly, and deserved an honest answer. He looked around the crowded diner the way a man looks around a room when he is used to being the one people watch without being watched back. Then he found an empty chair at a table near the window. And he walked toward it. And he asked the only question he needed to ask. "May I sit here?" The table went completely silent. One man at the counter laughed. Not with him, but at him, the kind of laugh that is meant to be heard. A woman 2 booths over rolled her eyes at her friend with the practiced contempt of someone who has decided what a person is before they have finished crossing the room. And the diner manager came out from behind the counter with a cold expression and a posture that said the answer was already decided before the question had finished landing. "We don't allow dogs in here." The veteran said nothing. He simply nodded once, the way a man nods when he has heard something unjust and has decided that arguing about it is beneath him. And in that moment of quiet dignity, while the diner filled with the comfortable noise of people who believed they had just watched something unimportant, nobody noticed what the dog had already noticed. Nobody saw what those amber eyes had already found in the corner of the room. Nobody understood that in the next 30 seconds, this ordinary Tuesday afternoon was about to become the most terrifying and most humbling moment of every single person's life in that building. And the man they had just laughed at was the only reason any of them were going to walk out of it. "May I sit here?" a disabled Navy SEAL asked, then his K9 shocked the entire diner. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a small American town diner when something unexpected walks through the door, a silence that is not really silence at all but rather the collective holding of breath, the momentary suspension of every fork and coffee cup and half-finished sentence as a roomful of people recalibrate their understanding of the space they are occupying. Millhaven, Virginia was the kind of town that produced that silence reliably and often, because Millhaven was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and the arrival of anything outside that known quantity was treated with the same mixture of curiosity and suspicion that a tightly woven community reserves for the unfamiliar. The Blue Ridge Diner sat on the corner of Main and Caldwell, a squat brick building with a hand-painted sign above the door that had been repainted exactly twice in 40 years, and a lunch counter that had served the same rotating cast of regulars for so long that their preferred seats had developed the quality of assigned territory, understood by everyone and contested by no one. On a Tuesday in late October, with the lunch crowd at its fullest and the smell of coffee and griddle grease hanging in the warm air like a permanent resident, the door opened and the afternoon changed. Ghost entered first, as he always did, because that was the way they had worked it out between them over 2 years of moving through the world together, the dog going ahead to read the room before the man committed himself to it. He was a German shepherd of extraordinary size and presence, his coat a dense cream white that caught the light differently than an ordinary dog's fur, something between the white of fresh snow and the pale gold of old ivory, and his eyes were the particular amber that looks almost orange in certain lights and almost yellow in others but is always, in every light, completely and disturbingly alert. He stepped through the door and paused on the threshold for exactly 3 seconds, his broad head moving in the unhurried systematic sweep of a trained animal performing a function it has performed so many times that it requires no conscious direction, cataloging the room, the exits, the people, the corners, the the spaces between the booths where a threat could exist without being immediately visible, and then he moved fully inside, and the door opened wider behind him. Jack Turner walked in behind his dog, and the diner noticed him the way small-town diners notice everything that does not fit their daily inventory of the familiar, which is to say immediately, and without any particular attempt at subtlety. He was 43 years old and carried those years the way a man carries years that have included things most people only read about, with a kind of compressed and quiet weight that was visible not in any single feature but in the total arrangement of him, the set of his shoulders, the steadiness of his eyes, the particular economy of his movements that communicated long and sustained practice at being efficient with his body because his body had not always been reliable, and he had learned to trust it only to the degree that he had earned that trust through the discipline of maintaining it. The metal brace on his left leg ran from just above the knee to just below it, a lightweight carbon fiber and titanium construction that was far less visible than the injury it compensated for but far more present than anything else about him in the minds of the people who had just looked up from their meals to watch him cross the floor. His cane was wooden, dark walnut, worn smooth at the handle in the way that things worn smooth by a particular hand over sufficient time become almost beautiful in their evidence of use. He moved with it not as a person moves who is learning to use a cane but as a person moves who has integrated it so completely into his physical vocabulary that it has become a third point of contact with the world, as natural and as unconscious as breathing. He was wearing a plain dark blue flannel shirt tucked into dark jeans, a canvas jacket the color of old military olive, and boots that had seen considerable use and had not been purchased for their appearance. There was nothing about his clothing that announced anything, no insignia, no visible decoration, no statement of any kind about who he was or what he had done or where he had been, because Jack Turner was not the kind of man who needed his clothing to make introductions for him, and had not been that kind of man even before the injury had given him other things to think about. His face was angular and lean, with the deep-set eyes and the particular quality of watchful stillness that belongs to people who have spent significant portions of their lives in environments where not watching carefully enough had real and permanent consequences. The scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his jaw was old enough to have settled into his face as simply one of its features, like the line of his nose or the set of his mouth, visible but not dramatic, the kind of thing that you noticed and then forgot because the face it lived in was too present and too engaged with the actual world to allow you to remain focused on any single detail of it for long. He looked around the diner with the unhurried attention of a man who is looking for a practical solution to a practical problem, which was that he was hungry, and there was a diner, and he needed a place to sit. His eyes moved across the lunch counter with its row of occupied stools, across the booths along the window wall where families and couples sat behind their plates, across the small tables in the center of the room, and found what he was looking for near the back left corner of the restaurant, a two-person table against the wall that had one empty chair and one occupied one. A man in his 50s in a contractor's vest reading something on his phone with the absorbed inattention of someone who has been alone with his screen long enough that the room around him has ceased to exist. Jack moved toward it with Ghost walking in his customary position, 2 steps ahead and slightly left, close enough to provide physical support if it was needed and close enough to respond to anything the room presented that required a response. Several people at nearby tables watched this approach with the open curiosity that substitutes for privacy in small places, their eyes moving from the dog to the man and back again with the particular quality of attention that is both fascinated and slightly uncomfortable, the attention of people who are interested in something they are not sure they are supposed to find interesting. Jack reached the table and stopped. He looked at the man with the phone with a courtesy that was genuine and simple and unperformed. He said, in a voice that was quiet enough to be private but clear enough to be completely understood, "May I sit here?" And those 4 words, which were the most ordinary possible request a person could make in a diner at lunchtime, landed in the immediate vicinity of the table with a weight that was entirely disproportionate to their content, because the man with the phone looked up from his screen, and looked at Jack, and looked at Ghost, and something moved across his face that was not quite hostility and not quite discomfort, but occupied the territory between them where both are possible. He said, after a pause that lasted 2 seconds longer than it needed to, that he was expecting someone. Jack looked at the empty chair, and looked at the man, and nodded once. The nod of a man who has heard an answer he suspected was coming, and has already decided it does not require a response, and turned to look for another option. It was at this moment that the diner manager appeared from behind the counter, moving with the particular purposeful stride of a man who has been watching a developing situation from a distance and has decided that it has developed far enough. His name was Craig Paulson, and he was 48 years old and had managed the Blue Ridge Diner for 11 years, having inherited the position from his uncle who had built the place and who had run it on the principle that a diner's job was to feed whoever walked through the door without prejudice or complication. Craig had maintained the feeding part of this principle with reasonable consistency, but had developed over the years a talent for complication that his uncle would not have recognized or approved of, a talent that expressed itself most reliably in the presence of situations that fell outside his comfortable daily routine and that required him to exercise the kind of judgment that genuine hospitality demands. He was a man of medium height and considerable certainty, with a broad flat face of someone who has spent years being right about small things and has mistaken that record for wisdom about large ones, and he moved toward Jack Turner with the expression of a man who has already decided what the situation is and what the correct response to it requires. He said, without preamble and without the courtesy of a lowered voice, that dogs were not allowed in the diner, and he said it in the tone of a man reciting a rule rather than speaking to a person, the tone that uses policy as a substitute for humanity and hides behind what is permitted in order to avoid confronting what is right. Jack turned to face him with the same quiet steadiness that he had brought to the table conversation, the steadiness of a man who has been spoken to in tones considerably less civil than this one in circumstances considerably more dangerous, and has survived all of them with his composure intact. He said that Ghost was a service animal and reached into the inside pocket of his canvas jacket and produced a folded document, a laminated card from the Department of Veterans Affairs certifying Ghost's status as a medically approved psychiatric and physical service animal, accompanied by a second document that described in clinical and specific language the nature of the injuries and conditions for which the animal had been prescribed. He held these out with the patience of a man who has done this before, in other diners and other public spaces, and who has learned that the documentation does not always accomplish what the documentation is supposed to accomplish. Craig Paulson looked at the documents with the expression of a man who is reading something he has already decided is irrelevant, and is only performing the act of reading as a formality before proceeding to the conclusion he reached before the reading began. He handed them back and said that it did not matter, that his diner had a policy, and that the policy was the policy regardless of what any paperwork said. He said this with the calm authority of a man who believes that authority is a function of volume and position rather than of reason or decency, and the diner, which had been performing the polite fiction of not listening to this exchange, stopped performing it entirely. The lunch counter had gone quiet. The booth nearest the confrontation had stopped eating. Two women at a table by the window were whispering to each other with the focused murmur of people exchanging a commentary they want to be partially audible. And from a stool at the far end of the counter, a large man in a camouflage hunting jacket, who had been working through a plate of eggs and sausage with the methodical appetite of someone who eats as a function rather than a pleasure, said loudly enough for the entire room to hear that some people would do anything for attention these days, and the laugh that followed this observation traveled through the diner with the easy cruelty of a laugh that has been given permission by its environment to exist without consequence. Jack Turner did not react to the laugh the way a man reacts to a laugh when he is wounded by it. He reacted to it the way a man reacts to a laugh when he has heard worse from people whose opinions mattered more, and has long since passed the point at which casual contempt from strangers registers as anything requiring a response. He looked at the man on the stool for a moment with those still gray eyes and then looked back at Craig Paulson and said, very quietly, that he understood and turned toward the door. And in the watching diner, in the room full of people who had just witnessed a small and ordinary cruelty performed on a man who had done nothing to deserve it, there was not one person who spoke up, not one voice that said wait, not one hand raised in the simple human gesture of objection that the moment was asking for. The only sound was the clink of someone setting their fork down on their plate, a sound so small and so insufficient that it barely qualified as a response to what had just happened, and Ghost turned his amber eyes across the room in the slow deliberate way he had of looking at things, and the room, without knowing exactly why, felt slightly less comfortable in itself than it had felt 30 seconds before. But Jack Turner did not reach the door. He had made it perhaps 6 steps from the table where Craig Paulson was still standing with the self-satisfied posture of a man who has enforced a policy and considers the matter closed, when an elderly woman at a table near the door spoke. She was perhaps 75, small and white-haired and dressed with the particular neat precision of a woman from a generation that considered going out in public a thing that required preparation, and she said, in a voice that was clear and firm and entirely without performance, that the young man was welcome to sit with her if he liked, that she had plenty of room, and that she could use the company. She said this without looking at Craig Paulson and without raising her voice to the volume that signals a challenge, simply making an offer in the tone of someone who has decided that the right thing and the simple thing happen to be the same thing in this instance, and sees no reason to complicate it further. Her name, Jack would learn later, was Eleanor Marsh, and she was a retired schoolteacher who had been eating lunch at the Blue Ridge Diner on Tuesdays for 22 years and who had, in that time, developed a very precise understanding of the difference between a rule that serves people and a rule that serves the person enforcing it. Jack turned toward her voice and looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief but something that lived between them, the expression of a man who has been braced for a door closing and has found instead a window opening, and he walked to her table and pulled out the chair across from her and sat down with the careful efficiency of a man managing a body that requires management, lowering himself into the chair with the practiced two-stage motion of someone who has learned to do this in a way that costs the least and reveals the least. Ghost moved to the space beside the table and lay down with the immediate settled quality of a dog who is always ready to rest and always ready to move, his broad head resting on his forepaws and his amber eyes open and conducting their continuous quiet inventory of the room. Eleanor smiled at the dog with the uncomplicated appreciation of a woman who has always liked animals and has never felt the need to justify it to anyone. And then she smiled. Craig Paulson stood at his position behind the counter for a moment with the expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered in a way he cannot immediately classify, and then turned back to his counterwork with the studied indifference of someone who has decided that what just happened does not require his acknowledgement, which was its own kind of statement about what had happened. The diner gradually resumed its lunch-hour conversation, the incident folding itself into the ongoing noise of the room, the way small events fold into the background of ordinary days, becoming already the thing that would be talked about later, rather than the thing being fully experienced now. But not everyone returned to their plates with equal ease. The man in the camouflage jacket at the counter stirred his coffee with the slightly subdued manner of a person whose joke has landed in a different way than he intended, or perhaps in exactly the way he intended, but in a room that has shifted slightly beneath him since he made it. The two women by the window had stopped whispering, and were eating with the quiet of people processing something they do not yet have the words for. And in the corner booth farthest from the door, pressed against the wall and mostly obscured by the high back of the booth seat, a man who had been sitting perfectly still since before Jack Turner walked through the door continued to sit perfectly still, his coffee untouched and cooling in front of him, his eyes moving very carefully and very slowly around the room in a way that was not the way people look at a room when they are simply waiting for their food. Ghost had noticed this man 11 seconds after entering the diner. He had catalogued him in the initial sweep of the room, noted the stillness that was different from the stillness of reading or thinking or simply waiting, noted the coffee that had not been touched in the time they had been inside, noted the particular quality of the man's attention, which was the attention of someone performing the appearance of not paying attention while paying very precise attention indeed, and he had filed all of this in the way that a trained working dog files information. Not as a conclusion but as an open case, something to continue monitoring while the more immediate requirements of the moment were addressed. He lay beside Eleanor Marsh's table with his head on his forepaws and his eyes conducting their patient and methodical survey of the room, and every 90 seconds or so those amber eyes returned to the corner booth and rested there for a moment before continuing their circuit. This was not a behavior anyone in the diner would have noticed or known how to read if they had noticed it, because it looked from the outside like an ordinary dog resting in an ordinary room, which was exactly what it was designed to look like. Jack Turner accepted the coffee that Eleanor's gesture had summoned a waitress to bring, a young woman named Danny who had served this diner for 3 years and who brought the cup to the table with the careful neutrality of someone navigating a social situation whose full dimensions she is still mapping, and he held the warm ceramic in both hands for a moment in the way that people hold warm things when they have been cold for a while, not because the diner was cold, but because there is a kind of coldness that has nothing to do with temperature and that a warm cup in both hands addresses in the only way it can be addressed, which is imperfectly and temporarily, and with the specific comfort of imperfect and temporary things. He and Eleanor spoke quietly, in the register of two people who have been placed in proximity by circumstances and have discovered, with a mild pleasant surprise that such discoveries produce, that the proximity is not uncomfortable. Eleanor asked him where he was from, and he said most recently from nowhere in particular, which she received with the understanding smile of a woman who has taught enough people to know that most recently from nowhere in particular is a complete and honest answer rather than an evasion. She told him she had lived in Millhaven for 50 years and had never once considered leaving it, and he said that sounded like a good life, and meant it in the complicated way that a man means it when the life he is describing is one he recognizes and cannot have, and has long since stopped grieving and has not quite succeeded in stopping. It was during this conversation, which had by this point moved to the mild and restoring subject of Eleanor's garden and the specific stubbornness of Virginia clay soil, that Ghost moved. Not dramatically, not with the sudden explosive motion of a dog responding to an active threat, but with the slow and deliberate rising of a dog who has been monitoring a situation and has reached the threshold at which monitoring becomes insufficient and presence becomes necessary. He rose from his position beside the table in the single fluid motion that very large well-conditioned dogs use when they rise from rest without urgency, coming to his feet and turning his body in the direction of the corner booth, with a quality of absolute focused attention that is different from his ordinary attentiveness in a way that Jack Turner recognized in the first half-second of seeing it. The way you recognize a change in a person you know very well, not because the change is large, but because you know them well enough that small changes are visible to you that would be invisible to everyone else. Jack's hand moved to the edge of the table and gripped it, not in panic but in the quiet preparatory way of a man who is making sure he can rise quickly if rising quickly becomes necessary. Ghost took 3 steps toward the corner booth and stopped. He did not bark. He did not growl. He simply stood with his body oriented toward the man in the corner, and his amber eyes fixed on that man with an attention so complete and so absolute that it had the quality of a physical force, the kind of attention that a prey animal feels from a direction it cannot immediately identify, and that produces in it the biological response of sudden and total stillness. The man in the corner booth felt it, and his own stillness changed its quality in the way that voluntary stillness changes when it encounters involuntary stillness, becoming something slightly more rigid and slightly less controlled, the stillness of a man who is working harder than before to appear relaxed. Ghost stood and looked at him, and the low sound that began in the dog's chest was not quite a growl yet, but was the frequency that precedes a growl, a subsonic communication directed at one specific recipient and carrying one specific message, which was that whatever the man in the corner booth was doing or planning or concealing, the dog knew about it, and the dog's person was about to know about it too. Jack Turner turned in his chair to look at what Ghost was looking at, and as his eyes found the man in the corner booth and began the same assessment that Ghost had already completed, he felt the specific cold clarity that settles over a person who has been in dangerous situations often enough that the recognition of danger does not arrive as panic but as information, clean and immediate and actionable, the body shifting from civilian mode into the older and more fundamental mode that his training had installed in him so deeply that no injury and no passage of time had succeeded in removing it. The man in the corner booth was approximately 35 years old, heavy-set, wearing a dark gray jacket that was too heavy for the temperature inside the diner, and he had the specific quality of stillness that Jack had learned to recognize in environments where stillness was a strategy rather than a state of being, the stillness of a man who is waiting for a specific moment to arrive, and who has been managing his own behavior carefully in the time before it does. His coffee was cold. His eyes were moving, and under the table, in a way that would have been invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for it and who did not know what they were looking at, the right side of his jacket was doing something that jackets do when the thing inside them is being repositioned by a hand. Ghost growled. The growl was not loud. That was the first thing that surprised the people who were close enough to hear it, because when a dog the size of Ghost produces a sound from deep in his chest, the expectation is that the sound will fill the room, will rattle the windows, will announce itself with the volume appropriate to the animal producing it. But Ghost's growl was not that kind of sound. It was low and controlled and continuous, the sound of an engine running at a specific and deliberate RPM, carrying in its frequency not the wild alarm of a frightened dog but the focused and professional warning of an animal that has been trained to communicate threat assessment rather than emotional response, and the specific quality of it, its steadiness, its direction, its absolute lack of any note of panic, was more frightening to the people who heard it than any loud and dramatic barking would have been. Because loud and dramatic barking is something you can rationalize. You can tell yourself the dog is nervous, is reacting to the crowd, is poorly trained, is overexcited by the smells and sounds of a busy diner. You cannot tell yourself those things about a sound like the one Ghost was making, because that sound did not leave room for alternative explanations. It said, with the precision of a well-calibrated instrument, that something specific and identifiable was wrong, and that the something was located in the corner booth against the far wall. The diner noticed. Not all at once and not with the clean simultaneity of a movie crowd responding to a single cue, but in the overlapping and slightly staggered way that real groups of real people notice things, one person turning from their plate and then the person beside them catching the movement and turning too, the awareness spreading outward from Ghost's position like a slow ripple from a stone dropped in still water. Conversations did not stop immediately but began to lose their threads, the words trailing off mid-sentence as attention redirected, and within 15 seconds the Blue Ridge Diner had achieved a quality of collective attention that it had not experienced at any point in its 40-year history. Every set of eyes in the room was moving between the dog and the corner booth, and the corner booth was doing something that corner booths do not ordinarily do, which was attempting, with decreasing success, to be invisible. The man in the dark gray jacket had gone completely still in the new and different way that Jack Turner had identified in the last moments before Ghost's growl, the way of a person whose plan has encountered a variable it did not account for, and who is running the calculation of how to respond faster than his expression can conceal the fact that he is running it. His right hand had stopped its movement under the table. His eyes, which had been performing the casual sweep of someone with nothing in particular on his mind, had narrowed to a specific and calculating focus that was directed at Ghost, and that carried in it a quality that Jack recognized from other contexts and other rooms as the quality of a man deciding how much time he has and whether what he has planned is still executable under the changed conditions. His name, as the police report filed later that afternoon would record, was Dennis Carver, and he had driven to Millhaven from Roanoke that morning with a loaded .38 caliber revolver in the inside pocket of his dark gray jacket, and a need for cash that had, over the course of the previous 3 weeks, graduated from urgent to desperate to the specific point beyond desperate where a person begins considering options they would not previously have considered. He had selected the Blue Ridge Diner because it was small and because its lunch crowd was predictable and because the register behind the counter was visible from the door and because the nearest police presence was, on a Tuesday afternoon, likely to be at least 8 minutes away. He had been sitting in the corner booth for 45 minutes waiting for the crowd to thin sufficiently, nursing the same cup of coffee, running the plan through its steps in his mind with the repetitive focus of someone trying to convert intention into inevitability through sheer force of rehearsal. And then a disabled veteran and a German shepherd had walked through the door, and the rehearsal had become complicated. Jack Turner rose from his chair. He did it with the 2-stage motion that his injury required, but he did it faster than he ordinarily allowed himself to do it, and the cane was in his right hand, not in the loose carrying grip of a man navigating a room, but in the firmer grip of a man who is accounting for the possibility that the next several seconds will require him to be more stable than his leg alone can make him. He spoke to the room, not loudly, not with the theatrical projection of a man making a performance of authority, but with the specific carrying quality of a trained voice that knows how to fill a space without effort, the voice of a man who has given instructions in environments where the instructions needed to reach their recipients through noise and chaos and fear. He said that he needed everyone to move to the left side of the diner and stay low, that he needed them to do it calmly and quickly, and that he needed them to do it right now. He did not explain why. He did not need to, because Ghost was still standing between the tables and the corner booth with his amber eyes fixed on Dennis Carver and his growl running at its low and continuous frequency, and the combination of the dog's absolute focused certainty and the veteran's quiet, absolute authority was sufficient to move a roomful of people without any further explanation being required. They moved. Not in a panic, not in the screaming, scrambling way of a crowd that has been told to run, but in the quick and slightly dazed compliance of people who have been given a clear instruction by someone who clearly knows more about the current situation than they do. sliding out of booths and off stools and moving to the left side of the diner with a clumsy, urgent shuffle of human bodies in a confined space trying to be fast and orderly simultaneously. Eleanor Marsh rose from her chair with a speed that surprised Jack and moved with the others, pausing for just a moment to put her hand briefly on Jack's arm as she passed, a touch that lasted less than a second and communicated more than a paragraph of words could have managed. And then she was moving with the rest of them, and Jack was turning his full attention to the corner booth. Craig Paulson, the diner manager who had enforced his policy with such confident authority 20 minutes earlier, was pressed against the back wall of the diner with his hands flat against the surface behind him, and his face carrying the specific expression of a man who is discovering in real time that the room he believed he controlled has been controlled by other forces entirely, and that the documentation he dismissed and the man he dismissed with it were, in the balance of the current situation, the only things standing between him and a very bad afternoon. Danny, the young waitress, had the presence of mind to reach under the counter as she moved past it and do the thing that the Blue Ridge Diners Insurance Company had required them to train for and that nobody on the staff had ever expected to actually use, which was to press the small red button mounted to the underside of the counter shelf that sent a silent alarm to the Millhaven police dispatcher 2 miles away. She pressed it once, and then pressed it again for certainty, and then moved to the far end of the left wall with her colleagues, and the timer that would determine whether help arrived in time or too late began its count from that moment. Dennis Carver had not moved from the corner booth, which was the intelligent choice in the sense that any movement he made toward the jacket pocket where the revolver was would give Ghost the signal to move, and Dennis Carver had understood in the first 5 seconds of the dog's focused attention that Ghost moving was not an outcome he wanted to produce. He was looking at Jack Turner with the expression of a man conducting a rapid reassessment of a situation he believed he understood, and discovering that he understood considerably less of it than he thought, and what he was reassessing most urgently was the man himself, the man with the cane and the metal brace and the quiet voice who was now standing 10 feet from his booth, and looking at him with eyes that were doing something that Dennis Carver had not anticipated, which was absolutely nothing. They were not wide with fear, and they were not narrowed with aggression, and they were not performing the exaggerated calm of a man who is frightened and trying not to show it. They were simply looking at him with the clean, steady attention of a man for whom this moment, terrifying as it was to every other person in the room, fell within a range of experience he had navigated before and knew how to navigate again. Jack spoke to him directly and without preamble. He said his name was Jack and that the dog's name was Ghost and that Ghost was very good at his job and that the best outcome for everyone in the room including Dennis was for Dennis to take his hand out from under the table slowly and place both hands flat on the table surface where they were visible, and that if he did this, the next few minutes would be considerably simpler than the alternative. He said this in the same quiet carrying voice, the voice that did not threaten because it did not need to threaten, the voice of a man whose authority in this moment was not derived from volume, or from the physical power that his injury had partially taken from him, but from something older and more fundamental. The authority of a person who has looked at dangerous things long enough that dangerous things can read in him the fact that he has looked at them and survived and is prepared to continue doing so. Ghost had not moved from his position between Jack and the booth, and the growl had not changed its frequency, and the combination of these two facts was communicating to Dennis Carver everything that Jack's words were also communicating, and doing it in a language that Dennis Carver's nervous system understood more directly than words. The hand came out from under the table. It came slowly, and with the visible effort of a man overriding a strong competing impulse. The fingers spread and the palm turning upward as it cleared the table edge and came into view, empty. The second hand followed it, both palms flat on the table. Dennis Carver looked at Jack Turner with the eyes of a man who has just made the most important decision of his life and is not entirely sure it was voluntary, and Jack held his gaze for a moment and then looked at Ghost and said, quietly and with the simple authority of 2 years of language built between them, "Good," and Ghost's growl ceased on that single syllable, cutting off as cleanly as a switch thrown. The silence it left behind so complete that the sound of the coffee machine dripping somewhere behind the counter was suddenly the loudest thing in the room. The police arrived in 6 minutes, which was 2 minutes faster than Dennis Carver's calculations had projected, and which was a difference attributable to the fact that the Tuesday afternoon shift in Millhaven had that week been covered by a deputy named Torres who happened to be parked 3 blocks from the diner eating a sandwich when the silent alarm reached dispatch. Deputy Torres entered the Blue Ridge Diner with her hand on her holster and her partner behind her, and found a scene that required several seconds of visual processing before she could assemble it into a coherent understanding. A scene consisting of one large white German shepherd sitting in the center aisle of the diner in a perfect sphinx position, watching a heavy-set man with both hands on a table in a corner booth. Approximately 30 people pressed against the left wall of the diner in various states of compression and pallor. A disabled veteran with a cane standing calmly between the dog and the corner booth with the expression of a man who has been waiting for the cavalry and is mildly relieved that the cavalry has arrived, and a diner manager pressed against the back wall who appeared to be having some kind of ongoing dialogue with his own conscience. Deputy Torres assessed all of this in the 3 seconds it took her to cross from the door to Jack Turner's position, and she said to him, as much in recognition as in inquiry, "Veteran?" And he said, "Yes, ma'am," and she said, "Thank you," and went past him to the corner booth where Dennis Carver was arrested without incident, the revolver recovered from his jacket pocket loaded with 5 rounds, the 6th chamber empty in the way that revolvers are sometimes carried by people who are trying to preserve some minimal psychological distance between themselves and what they are planning to do. The arrest took 4 minutes. During those 4 minutes, the Blue Ridge Diner existed in a state that had no precise name in the ordinary vocabulary of Tuesday afternoon experiences, a state that was somewhere between shock and relief, and the specific quality of social discomfort that descends on a group of people who have just collectively realized something significant and uncomfortable about themselves and are standing in the same room with the evidence of it. Because the people of the Blue Ridge Diner had laughed at this man. They had rolled their eyes at him, and made their jokes about attention-seeking, and enforced their policies at him, and looked the other way when a 75-year-old retired schoolteacher was the only person in the room who offered him a seat. And now they were standing against the left wall of their familiar Tuesday diner, understanding that the man they had done all of those things to had just organized their survival with a quiet authority that none of them possessed, and had done it without raising his voice, and without a single gesture toward the fact that he had earned the right to be considerably less gracious about the situation than he was being. Craig Paulson was the first to move. He came away from the back wall with the slightly unsteady gait of a man whose legs have been remembering what his mind had temporarily been too frightened to think about, and he crossed the diner to where Jack Turner was standing, and he stopped in front of him, and he opened his mouth once and closed it and opened it again. And what came out of it was not the polished apology of a man who has had time to compose his words, but the rough and unedited apology of a man speaking from the place where words come from when all the usual filters have been stripped away by something large and real. He said he was sorry. He said it twice, the second time with more weight than the first, the weight of a man who is understanding as he speaks that the word he is using is not adequate to the thing he is apologizing for, but is the only word available, and so must serve. He said that he had been wrong, and that he had been rude, and that he had hidden behind a policy because it was easier than doing the right thing, and that he understood if Jack did not want to hear any of this from him. Jack looked at him for a long moment with those steady gray eyes, and then he extended his hand, and Craig Paulson took it and held it with both of his, and the handshake lasted a beat longer than handshakes ordinarily last, the length of time that it takes for one person to communicate to another that the thing being offered has been received. The man in the camouflage hunting jacket at the counter, the man who had made the attention-seeking joke with such easy confidence, had been very quiet since Deputy Torres had arrived, and he remained quiet now. But his quietness had changed its quality from the quietness of someone who has nothing to say to the quietness of someone who has too much to say and has not yet found the beginning of it. He was a man named Bill Harding, 54 years old, who drove a truck for a regional hauling company, and who ate at the Blue Ridge Diner 4 or 5 times a week when his routes brought him through Millhaven, and who had made the joke because it was the kind of joke that the environment of the diner on an ordinary Tuesday had made feel safe to make. The kind of joke that a room full of comfortable people makes at the expense of someone who does not fit the room's comfortable definition of belonging. He sat on his stool now with his hands around his cooling coffee, and the understanding of what his joke had been and what it had been made at the expense of sitting in him with a specific heaviness of things that cannot be unsaid and can only be lived with, and after a long time he said, to no one in particular and to everyone in the room, that he owed the man an apology, and that he knew it, and that he was sorry, and he said it in the direction of Jack Turner, without looking up from his coffee because looking up was more than he could manage at that exact moment, and the words were already costing him everything he had. Jack Turner sat back down at Eleanor Marsh's table. He sat down with the same careful two-stage motion, and he picked up the coffee cup that Danny had refilled at some point during the preceding 15 minutes with the quiet efficiency of a young woman who had decided that keeping cups full was the most useful contribution she could make to the current situation. And he held it in both hands as he had held the first cup, and the warmth of it was the same warmth, imperfect and temporary and sufficient. Ghost came back to his position beside the table, and lay down and put his great pale head on his forepaws and closed his eyes for a moment with the satisfaction of an animal that has completed a task it was assigned and found the completion adequate, and then opened them again because the habit of watching was too deeply installed to be suspended for more than a moment even in safety. Eleanor Marsh was looking at Jack with the expression that a person wears when they have understood something they did not expect to understand today, and are sitting with the weight of understanding it. She said that she supposed he had done this kind of thing before, the keeping people safe kind of thing, and he said that he had done his best at it, and she said that she thought his best was considerable, and there was a quality in the way she said it that was neither flattery nor performance but the simple honest assessment of a woman who has been watching people for 75 years and has a very accurate calibration of what she sees. The diner around them had begun the slow process of returning to something like itself. People moving back to their tables and their booths and their counterstools with a slightly dazed deliberateness of people who are doing familiar things in a space that has been made permanently unfamiliar by what happened in it. And Danny was moving through the room, refilling cups, and taking new orders with the careful grace of someone tending to a room that needs tending, and the coffee machine was doing its reliable work behind the counter, and the ordinary sounds of an American diner were reassembling themselves from the silence that Ghost's growl had imposed on them. It was then that the old man in the third booth stood up. He was perhaps 80 years old, slight and carefully dressed in a white button shirt and dark slacks, with the upright bearing of a man who had learned posture in a context where posture was not optional and had never fully unlearned it, and he stood with the deliberate purpose of someone who has decided to do something and is doing it without hurry and without apology. The diner, which had been gradually recovering its noise, went quiet again in the way it goes quiet when something is about to be said that the room understands it should hear. The old man looked at Jack Turner for a moment, and then he said, in a voice that was thin with age but clear and steady with something that was not age at all, that he wanted to say something if the young man would permit it. Jack looked at him and nodded once. The old man said that he was a veteran himself, Korea, 1952, and that he had come home from Korea to a country that did not always know how to receive what he brought back with him, and that he had spent 60 years watching young men and women go out and come back and be received with varying degrees of the welcome they deserved. He said that what had happened in this diner today, the discourtesy and the laughter and the policy enforcement, and then the thing that came after it, the thing the young man and his dog had done without being asked and without requiring anything in return, was a thing he wanted to acknowledge while there was still time and while the people who needed to hear the acknowledgement were still in the room to hear it. He looked around at the diner and at the people in it, and then he looked back at Jack and he said, "Son, today you protected this place the same way you protected our country, and the only difference is that today we were here to see it." The diner was completely silent for the duration of that sentence and for the several seconds that followed it. Not the silence of a room that has nothing to say but the silence of a room that has been given something too large for immediate response, the silence of people who are sitting with something true. And then, one by one and in no particular order, people stood. The couple in the window booth. The two women who had whispered to each other when Jack came in. The family with the children who had been eating near the counter. Bill Harding from his stool, slowly, with the specific weight of a man who is not sure he deserves to stand but is standing anyway because not standing would be worse. Craig Paulson from behind his counter. Danny from the center of the room where she had stopped walking. They stood, and they were quiet, and the quiet was not empty but full of the things that people carry for the people who carry things for them, full of the specific and complicated gratitude that a community feels when it has been protected by someone it failed to protect first. Jack Turner looked at the old man, and then he looked at the room, and he did not say anything for a long moment, and Ghost lifted his great head from his forepaws and surveyed the standing room with his amber eyes and then looked up at Jack with the patient and complete attention of a dog who has been beside this man through enough to know that whatever comes next, whatever the man decides, will be the right decision, because the man always decides correctly about the things that matter, and Ghost has the evidence of years to support this assessment. Jack set his coffee cup down and looked at Eleanor Marsh, who was watching him with the expression she had been wearing since the moment she invited him to sit. The expression of a woman who saw him clearly and completely from the beginning, and whose offer of a chair had been an offer of more than a chair. And she smiled at him with the warm and uncomplicated smile of someone who is glad to have been right about a person. He reached down and put his hand on Ghost's head, and the dog pressed upward into the touch with the quiet contentment of a creature whose person is within reach and whose work is done. And Jack said, to the room and to Eleanor and to no one in particular, that he thought he would have that coffee after all if the offer was still open, and Eleanor said that it was absolutely still open and always would be, and Danny, who had been holding a coffee pot for 30 seconds waiting for exactly this moment, moved to the table and filled the cup with the careful attention of someone performing a small act that she understands is not small at all. And the Blue Ridge Diner in Mill Haven, Virginia, on a Tuesday in late October, gradually and imperfectly and humanly began the process of becoming a place that had learned something it would not forget. Ghost lay back down beside the table, and put his head on his forepaws and closed his eyes in the particular way that a working dog closes its eyes when it has done its job and been acknowledged for it, and is prepared to rest in the knowledge that the person it exists to protect is safe and warm, and among people who now understand what they are sitting beside. His white coat was luminous in the afternoon light that came through the diner's window, and his amber eyes, which had seen everything today and would continue to see everything tomorrow, were closed, and his breathing was the slow and even breathing of an animal at peace with itself, and with its purpose, and with the man whose left side it would occupy for all the years available to them, however many or few those years turned out to be. And in the Blue Ridge Diner, the coffee was hot and the afternoon was quiet, and the right man was finally in the right seat. And the only sound was the comfortable ordinary sound of a roomful of people who had been humbled and changed and were sitting together in the aftermath of it, which is the sound that a community makes when it has been reminded of what it is supposed to be.